I do not, for one, think that the problem was that the band was down. I think that the problem may have been that there was a Stonehenge monument on the stage that was in danger of being crushed by a dwarf.
You're listening to Binnall of America Audio.
If I were to ask you what your philosophy of life or your creed, what would that be?
Have a good time all the time. That's my philosophy, Marty.
The next thing I wanted to ask you about is you talk about the filming of an episode of Penn and Teller's Bullshit, and but you didn't talk about really how the episode came out, and I want to ask you how that did come out, because I know a lot of people in the esoteric world have been on the show, and, you know, they kind of got the short shrift, if you will, from Penn and Teller when they presented the case. I was just wondering how you fared after they put you through the grinder.
Well, I wasn't so much put through the grinder. I think, you know, it's like a lot of shows, you know, in terms of their approach, it's more of a skeptical approach. And I think they basically just came to the conclusion, you know, the things we were looking for weren't really, you know, that we didn't find evidence for them. It literally wasn't any more or any less than that, really. You know, I'm not really sure how other people have come up, because I actually don't have the channel on our TV that it's broadcast on. I think it's Showtime, so I only got the video of our one episode. So, you know, I'm a little unsure as to what went on the other one. But it was, you know, I think, you know, the nature of the show is that it's like a look at unsolved mysteries. But, you know, if the evidence isn't there, they conclude, you know, that you didn't find the evidence. So yeah. That was basically it with that one.
Yeah, it's mostly just well, I saw like the first couple seasons. I'll have to look and see which one. You're on the ghosts one?
Yeah, that's right. This was actually nothing to do with cryptozoology.
Yeah.
It was sort of like a ghost hunting one in a haunted hotel in Texas. But again, as I said, you know, I don't have Showtime on our TV, so I've never actually seen the show.
It's pretty good. It's kind of neat to see some of the people like Jim Mars and I'm trying to think of some of the other people that I've seen on there. But it's always like they, you know, we never win on that show. On that show, you already know that going in. Like when you go to watch it, kind of like you said, you know from the show. But sometimes the things they say are like so biting that you're like, all right, you know. You don't, you know, like, I know Jim Mars. I don't think he's like a crazy asshole or whatever, you know, something crazy they would say. You know, they really sort of like take pot shots, so I just hope that didn't happen to you.
Well, from the bits that I saw, it didn't. As I said, you know, I don't actually have Showtime, so I've never seen the show other than extracts from the one that I was on. But, you know, as I said, it's one of these things where, you know, you get shows that take a critical approach if the evidence isn't there, and you go in, if you want to do the show, that's fine. It's not like anybody's bending your arm to do it. You know, you go into some of these programs knowing that if you're up against skeptics, you know, what the outcome's going to be. So.
Have you ever done like a TV show and then been disappointed after the fact that it turned out, you know, that they went after you, or they, you know what I mean, like that they were skeptical, and maybe, because like when I talked to Jim about this, he said, you know, the crew and everything that came down to film him were like the coolest guys, and they were totally down with what he was talking about. I think it was JFK assassination, and, you know, they totally understood. They were probably freelance dudes from around Texas. Yeah. But then when it got out to L.A. or whatever, then the whole thing took on a different, like, flavor. Have you ever had something like that happen?
Yeah, I think, everybody, you know, just talking about shows in general, I think the hazard with TV, and I'm not even any specific shows, just generally here. I think one of the hazards of doing TV work when the show isn't live is the fact that, you know, they may film you for 5 or 6 hours, and then they have to condense, you know, the interviewees down to an hour-long program, which has 3 15-minute commercial breaks, or 5-minute commercial breaks, and maybe they've interviewed another 6 or 7 people for the show, so your part is cut down from 6 hours of filming to sort of maybe 7 minutes. And one of the hazards is that, you know, your words can either be taken out of context sometimes, or not usually so much taken out of context, but you just edit it down so much that you're not able to get the important critical points across. And maybe, you know, they just focus on generalities. That's one of the problems. And of course, you know, you don't have any say what ends up on the cutting room floor and what ends up on the show.
Yeah.
You know, that's just down to the editors. You know, I found that several times myself where, yeah, I've done a TV show. I've presented, for example, government documents confirming, you know, where a pilot, for example, seen a UFO. And then we find that at a nearby base 10 miles away, the radar operator was tracking the UFO at the same time. And I presented the documents with the top secret stamp on, or the secret stamp, or whatever. And then when the show is broadcast, you sit down and watch it, and none of that appears. And it's Nick Redfern believes UFOs exist because, his dad saw one when he was in the RAF or whatever. Well, why mention that? Why not just show previously classified documents that confirm these events?
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's often that the good stuff gets left behind. And unfortunately, that's just partly sometimes due to the nature and the bias of the program, and other times it's just due to the fact that they've got a small show with loads of people to interview, and what was originally a huge in-depth interview ends up as just soundbite quotes here and there.
Yeah.
And but I don't think that's necessarily just relative to ufology or even the paranormal. I think that's, if there's some TV documentary on the history of the Second World War or whatever, you have the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what it is, really. That's just TV, unfortunately.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. One of the big themes in the book is this synchronicity that seems to follow you when it comes to the esoteric, and strange sort of things sort of happen. I'm sure you can tell them anyway yourself, but like the MJ-12 and the plane that says JM-12 or JM-21 or something like that, and you're going to a conference, and it turns out it's going to be at your sister-in-law's place or something along those lines. And it seems to keep coming up over and over and over again in the book. I guess just talk a little bit about that synchronicity, and what do you think that's all about?
Well, I think one of the things I've found, and this is one of the reasons why I think what appears to be black and white issues relative to different aspects of the paranormal, whether it's cryptozoology or ufology, one of the reasons I think they're not black and white is this issue of repeated synchronicities that a lot of people in the subject have. And it's not something special to me. It's nothing, I'm not anything special at all. It just literally is the case that the more and more that people delve into these puzzles, it's almost like there's some hidden hand guiding them in different directions, and as I said, weird coincidences and bizarre synchronicities begin to happen to where you almost actually kind of question reality, or are we living in some sort of weird Matrix type world or whatever? And I point this out in the book that on repeated occasions I've had weird experiences where you begin to think, well, there's no way this meeting or this thing could have happened by chance. And when it keeps happening, you think, well, what's the point of it? Who's doing it, and why is it happening? But I mean, a few classic examples. You mentioned about conferences. The Texas Bigfoot conference in 2004, which I was booked to speak at, so I got a call from the organizer, said, would you like to come and speak? Yep, that's fine, no problem at all. We booked her into this particular bed and breakfast, and they're like, oh yeah, I know where that is. And I said, oh, how do you know where that is? I said, because it's my wife's aunt who runs the place. That's just like a down-to-earth thing that could happen to anybody. Mm-hmm. But, there have been some stranger ones. You mentioned the MJ-12 story. This was a really weird one. This was when I was traveling to Puerto Rico with Paul Kimball in 2005. And obviously with Paul being in Canada, he'd flown down from Canada to Puerto Rico, and I'd flown across from Texas to Puerto Rico. Paul had me going on a completely weird journey. But, that's a different story. But anyway, I was sat on the tarmac at I forget where it was anyway now. It was some particular airport that Paul had me at. And talking actually with a guy sat next to him, he was a military guy of all things, about Roswell, because he asked, just got chatting, and I said, I write books about UFOs and mysteries, and we got talking about Roswell. And lo and behold, as we got talking about Roswell, this plane sort of just taxied past the window at the back where I could see it, and the tail letters on the aircraft were 12 MJ, which, is like MJ-12.
Yeah. And
so I quickly snapped a photograph off, and it's actually on my UFO Mystic blog. You can see the photograph there. That was a little weird, the fact that you'd be talking about Roswell and these secret groups, and then this aircraft trundles by with 12 MJ-12 on the tail letters. But again, these are just a couple of cases of countless numbers of reports that not just me, but many people in these types of subjects have had, where sometimes it's like almost as if something's guiding you to meet certain people or be in certain places at the right time. Others, it's almost as if it's opening your eyes and kind of trying to give you a clue to something. And I don't pretend to even have an answer as to why it's happening or who's doing it or for what purpose. I just know that the more you dig into these things, the more these strange coincidences and synchronicities seem to happen.
Yeah. And then here's a little compare and contrast type of question for you that you're probably one of the few people that could answer it. UK field research versus US field research. Are there any big similarities or differences between the two countries and when you're doing field research? You know, maybe the witnesses are hesitant to talk in one country or less hesitant. You know what I mean?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences is based upon the fact of the different sizes of the countries. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, Britain itself, England, Scotland and Wales, the square mileage is actually smaller than the three countries combined, England, Scotland and Wales, the square mileage is smaller than the square mileage of the state of Texas.
Oh, wow.
It's literally like about 50 miles smaller, I think, something like that. And so, you know, you bear in mind the sheer scale of the size of America compared to Britain. One of the things I think, one of the big differences is that because, you know, all of us in paranormal studies are usually, unless we're really lucky, you know, we're always sort of strapped for cash and to do investigations.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's no way that I can sort of live in Dallas here and jet off to California tomorrow and then jet off to Nebraska on Tuesday and then New York on Wednesday to do investigation. You know, I'll be bankrupt inside a week. You know, it's just not feasible because the country's so big. So one of the big differences, I think, is that in America, a lot of the investigations are always undertaken by groups local to that area. Whereas in Britain, you know, when I used to live over there, somebody might phone me up and say, hey, you know, I've got a story of a crashed UFO in Scotland. And it's like, well, you know, I'll get in the car, I'll be there in 5 hours or 6 hours or whatever. Or avoid the cops 4 hours. And you know, or somebody said that a crop circle's appeared down in Wiltshire, which is like a 3-hour drive from where I used to live. The advantage there is that everybody in the subject in England, whether it was crop circles, ufology, cryptozoology, everybody pretty much knows everybody else, not just by reputation, but by face. You know, and everybody hangs out with each other at the same conferences because, you know, there's nowhere really that's going to take you more than a day sort of half a day to drive to, unless you're at the bottom of the country driving to the very top, and then it's no more than a day. So, you know, I think that's the big difference, was that in Britain there's more of like a united countrywide scene where everybody's getting involved and everybody's friends and knows each other. Whereas over here, I think it's more, you know, there's a lot of people who I've corresponded with on things like UFO updates, but I wouldn't have a clue what they look like. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because you just never see these people. Mm-hmm. And that's not a criticism. It's just the fact that, you know, the countries are so different in size that you just don't get to meet up with certain people, and a lot of reports get localized. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, when there's a lot of local investigations going on, people perhaps on the other side of the country don't necessarily always get to hear about them. Yeah. That can be a problem in terms of sharing information. Less so now the internet's, you know, up and running, obviously, but, you know, in years past, I think a lot of stuff might have got bypassed, people just not knowing about it. But I think for the most part, it kind of parallels quite closely. I don't think there's that many differences. You know, you have people in both countries going to archives looking for government files, or, you know, going out into crop circles and trying to do scientific tests on them, or investigating abductions, hypnosis, that sort of thing. I don't think there's that many differences. I think in Britain there's more, I wouldn't say more of a skeptical approach to the UFO subject. I would say that perhaps the alien angle is less dominated in Britain than it is over here. And, you know, people are perhaps more inclined to look at some of these weirder, more esoteric ideas of, interdimensional things, or, you know, paranormal aspects to these phenomena, rather than just, you know, nuts and bolts spaceships, etc. Mm-hmm. And I think with cryptozoology as well, I think, again, because Britain is a small country and it's easy to travel around, and there aren't a lot of really massive forests. Yes, there's a lot of, you know, big forests, but not anything like the Pacific Northwest. it becomes easier to get into some of these locations where these creatures have been seen. But then you find, as I said, a lot of these reports have been made near old stone circles and burial mounds, and which again are quite accessible. So I think in that respect, there's this tendency or approach that people realise that, it's not just the case of some large lumbering ape running around the woods, that's not feasible in Britain to do that.
Yeah.
There's no way a colony of 50 Bigfoot could hide out. There's no way they could live.
Mm-hmm.
But the reports are no less credible than they are over here. But I think because of the nature of the country, people realise that, hang on, there's got to be more or something stranger to it. So those are the main differences, I think.
Is there anything in the esoteric world that you haven't researched that you'd like to, when things settle down a little bit? I know you don't, you're a writer, you don't want things to settle down, but is there anything you'd like to look into someday that you haven't had a chance to dive into yet?
That's a good question. I mean, for someone who's sort of involved in the paranormal, I'm interested in ghostly type things, but I'm not massively interested in all that, psychic phenomena and ghosts and poltergeists. I think it's interesting to read, but I'm not sort of passionate about it to where, I get involved. But one of the things that particularly interests me, and that I've written about sort of chapters here and there, but I'd like to get more involved in, is the whole issue of werewolf stories. And again, for people before they, the jaws drop to the floor, I don't think, people at the sight of the full moon are sprouting fur and fangs and, running around and howling at the moon. I don't think that's happening in like a classic Hollywood style. But again, we get a lot of reports in England of what look like sort of classic Hollywood American Werewolf in London type werewolves. And again, a lot of them have been reported in the vicinity of ancient prehistoric areas of significance. One of the theories, and I think this is kind of an interesting one that's been put forward, is that perhaps ancient man had mental abilities that, we've lost. And one of the theories that's been put forward is that they were able to kind of create imagery, almost like a psychic alarm clock or guard dog. Some local tribe would infringe on their territory, and then suddenly this weird creature would appear, but it would be an apparition, a creation of the mind.
Yeah.
And that one of the theories is that perhaps some of these creations, in some sort of semi-limbo existence, actually are still around and could be seen from time to time. And that perhaps that's what some of these things are. People deliberately created these monstrous images years ago, and there's like a residual energy left. Again, it's a controversial theory, but that's what I think some of these werewolf type things could be.
Yeah.
But that's one of my other interests is, sort of allegedly real life werewolf encounters. So I'd like to do something along those lines, and just keep doing the crypto stuff and more investigations, on the road type investigations. I think that's really the particularly with cryptozoology, but also with ufology. Actually getting out there is one of the key ways we're going to get the answers if we have a chance of finding them.
Definitely. And one of the things that's really kind of fascinated me in the last 4 months or so, and something that I'll be looking into, I'll be trying to find the answer to my own question here that's coming up. But they're what I like to call the lost mysteries of esoterica. I'm talking about stuff like Bermuda Triangle, spontaneous human combustion, even Amelia Earhart. And I have a feeling someday Roswell will join this group. And I kind of feel like the Loch Ness Monster's on its way to this realm of the lost mysteries of esoterica. Why do you think these stories, which were pretty wildly popular, like in the 70s and 80s at least, because I remember seeing those Time Life book commercials, and, definitely Bermuda Triangle was one of the big guns of esoterica, and now it's like you barely ever hear about it anymore. Why do you think these things seem to fall off the radar of the paranormal?
Well, I think a part of it, Tim, at least, is that, public interest and researcher interest changes. I mean, it's like, if you focus on the UFO subject, if you go back and read a lot of the books from the 50s, it was all the government's either hiding all this nuts and bolts UFO technology, kind of like a Donald Kehoe type scenario with cover-ups, etc., or you had the George Adamski, George Van Tassel type stuff of, contactees and people being whisked around Jupiter by the space commander with ridiculously stupid names or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and almost like Pamela Anderson type space babes and things like that, which would that's that for me, that's the sort of thing that should come back. But no, I think part of it at least, I think, is that for whatever reason, there's good evidence with ufology that the phenomenon itself is changing and manipulating us. You know, as I said earlier, it began with things like the mystery airships, then the Foo Fighters, the ghost rockets, flying saucers, flying triangles, long-haired aliens, greys, things like this. You know, go back 40 years, a lot of reports of soil samples being taken by aliens, or vehicle interference cases, people's cars stopping in the middle of the road. Things like that now, we rarely get reports like that anymore. And I think because the phenomenon changes, sometimes the interest changes to differing degrees. It's like crop circles in England. Crop circles in the late 80s, from about 89 to 91, I mean, it was major news. You know, people at the BBC would cover it on the nighttime news in the summer when all these formations were at their height. And that's pretty much died off now, aside from the fact that, you know, you'll get a couple of days in the summer where the mainstream newspapers will report the crop circles are back, you know, and then it's gone till next year. And I think, on the one hand, people kind of get used to these things. I think the other issue is that when the mysteries aren't solved, sometimes, and this applies to the research community as well, not just the media and the general public, people walk away from them because they get frustrated at the fact that this mystery that they've been looking into for so long remains unresolved, and they never did get to the bottom of it. And so, you know, they leave it alone, nobody else takes up the challenge, and it vanishes. And I think it's the same, you know, you look back 100 years, in the Victorian times, for example, one of their big things was seances. You know, that was a huge thing in England back then, you know, rapping on tables, that sort of thing. And again, you don't see that at a great level now. You know, that's kind of been replaced by, I guess, the equivalent of things like ghost hunters and those type of things. Yeah. So, again, it's not so much the phenomenon's changed, but I think approaches have changed. There's, you know, differing opinions on different parts of different people as to what might be going on. There's people who've walked away from the subjects because they haven't solved it. No one else has come to take the mantle after they've gone. And, you know, so they do go into limbo. It's like one of the ones I always found fascinating was the Philadelphia experiment. You know, I don't know what happened there, but certainly, you know, when Bill Moore's and Charles Berlitz's book of the same name came out, that was big news. And then it got, you know, picked up again a few years afterwards, a few years after that, and that seems to have gone quiet. And I think, again, it's purely and simply because there aren't many people who necessarily replace the original people. So I think there's, you know, I agree with you. There's a lot of great mysteries out there that, unfortunately, you know, with the human attention span, we forget they are out there. Yeah. And people, you think, well, you know, why didn't somebody go back and investigate this? It's a great story. So. Yeah, it's weird. It's a strange sort of turn of events. All right, now we'll segue into these questions that I got from the two writers we have at the website, and also one of our big time listeners, my boy Richard in Wales. He sent in a couple questions. He's sort of like my UK correspondent. He has two questions, and I have a follow up to the first one. So we'll just start with he wanted to know about the alien big cat sightings in Wales. He sent me a specific story where his sister had seen a big cat, so it's obviously something that's resonated with him. And he just wants to know a little bit about the big cat sightings in Wales and the rest of Great Britain. Okay. Well, certainly in Britain, definitely since the early 1980s and right through to the present day, there's been a massive amount of reports, literally hundreds and hundreds per year now, of sightings of so-called mystery big cats. Predominantly, they're sort of like a puma-type cat, if you like. You would even get occasional reports of where people said they've seen lions, tigers, lynxes, things like that. But for the most part, they're sort of like a black puma-type animal. And, you know, we do get a lot of reports from Wales, and I think one of the reasons is it's sort of, in many cases, like a mountainous, wild area. There's lots of sheep running around, you know, on the farms, and it's an ideal place for an animal to hide out, a predatory animal. We get a lot of reports from Devon and Cornwall, which again are kind of, windswept moorland-type locations straight out of Pound of the Baskervilles, where, again, it would be quite easy for these creatures to breed and hide. Central England, where I used to come from, a lot of big forests there, one called the Cannock Chase, which is actually about 15 minutes from where I used to live, and they used to get a lot of reports from there. So again, these are, all good breeding locations, and I don't think anybody, even the police or the authorities, doubt that there are wild cats out there. I think where the authorities dispute things is that they don't doubt that there are wild cats. They dispute whether or not there are big cats out there.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between a wild cat, a feral cat, and, quote, a big cat. So, I think they kind of like to or prefer to play the matter down because, this image of giant cats wandering around the British countryside isn't one that the authorities want to instill in the minds of the British public. I actually think that is a legitimate concern, and I think it's deliberately being played down for that reason, because they know the press will whip it up with stories about the beast on the loose and things like that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, there are a couple of reports of people being attacked, but they're always kind of like a grey area, and I think these things prefer to remain out of human sight and focus on the things they know they can kill and eat without any problems. But yeah, there's definitely hundreds of reports per year. But equally, we get strange reports as well, esoteric reports. As I mentioned, big cats haven't been seen in crop circles. Big cats literally vanishing, and I do mean vanishing in the blink of an eye, literally vanishing. You either dismiss these reports or you have to put them with all the body of evidence and try and determine what's going on, with respect to these stories and how do we explain them. But, there's no doubt, though, that people are seeing these things all across Britain every year.
Yeah. His little sighting here that he sent me was a few years ago. My younger sister and her friend, while out in South Wales countryside, saw what they described as a very big black cat carrying a fully grown sheep in its mouth. So, that probably sums up pretty much what the big cat type. That's a big cat.
Yeah.
And the question I had, the follow-up question that sort of I had to his question was, why do you think, now you've said they've had big cat sightings in Puerto Rico, and I'm sure they've had them in America, but why do you think the big cat got so big, and no pun intended, I guess you could say, why do you think the big cat story got so popular and big in England? Because it's really one of the big esoteric stories over there in England is the big cat thing. And over here in America, I don't even know if it's in the top 10 of paranormal mysteries here.
Well, I think one of the main reasons why is because, Britain being a small island, there actually, there are one or two researchers who've taken the opinion that there could be like a hidden species of big cat that's indigenous to Britain that's always lived here and has never been identified. I think that's stretching it a bit, but some people do subscribe to that. But I think the reason why it's captured so much attention is because there's nothing like that supposed to live in Britain. Over here, people say, oh, well, we get mountain lions, we get lynxes and things like that. It's not surprising. But in Britain, there shouldn't be anything like that wandering around the countryside. It's almost like the equivalent of somebody saying they saw a rhinoceros or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think there's that angle. I think there's also kind of like the mystique, the idea that in the world that we think's modern and we know everything, that there are these little mysterious little old towns and villages in England and old woods and forests that haven't changed for centuries, and there are these weird creatures living in them. There's like that, the angle that everybody, as a kid, there are monsters hiding under the bed, and I think that's like the adult equivalent in some respects, from not in that it's in the imagination, but from the perspective how it's perceived. It's, there's, life isn't just paying the mortgage and going to work. There's like entertaining weird stories out there. I think that, it captures the public's imagination. So I think that's one angle. Now, I think the other reason why it's attracted so much attention is because it's undoubtedly a real valid mystery. It's not something just conjured up out of the minds of the people's imagination. And the reason I say that is because back in the 1976, the British government passed something called the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. That basically meant that if before then you could actually keep like an exotic big cat on your property if it was sort of well maintained. But when they passed this act, you had to get a license, which cost huge amounts of money even back then. Many people couldn't afford it. So they were faced with two possibilities. They would have to have the animal destroyed, or they would have to hand it over to the authorities, or give it to a zoo or whatever, and it'd be stuck in like a cramped 12-foot by 12-foot cage or whatever.
Yeah.
In some cheap zoo. A lot of people didn't want to take either alternative, so what they did, they would drive out to the woods and forests in the middle of the night, and if they got two or three of them, they'd let them all go together, so hopefully they could survive together and breed. A lot of people did that. 99.9% of them would never admit it because of possibly being prosecuted even. So in that respect, that's how we know that this mystery is a valid one, and I think it offers people the idea that, wow, this is a weird mystery, but it's one we could actually solve. And I think that's why a lot of people get involved in big cat investigations in England, because it is one that offers the researcher the possibility of actually getting the evidence. It wouldn't surprise me if one day somebody, news flash on the TV or whatever, some guy driving home late at night hits something, thinks he's hit a dog, and it's, like a 7-foot-long puma or whatever. I think that probably will happen one day, because this isn't, for the most part at least, something intangible. There's a valid reason why some of these things are out there.
Yeah.
So that makes, like, the lure of the chase is more plausible, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and this is Richard's second question here, and he wants to know if you know anything about the Welsh UFO triangle story. It's a sighting, and it's also known as the West Wales Flap of 1977.
Yeah, there was a lot of weird reports in Wales in 1977 of UFO activity, of landings, of things coming out the sea, reportedly of like entities wandering around the Welsh countryside and being seen in little villages. And I'll be honest, I don't know a great deal about it. A couple of books have been written, one by a guy named Peter Paget, which was called The Welsh Triangle. And I think the best way to describe it is kind of like these classic UFO flap situations you get.
Yeah.
Kind of like a Point Pleasant in the mid-60s with the Mothman and UFOs and Men in Black type stories and things like that. It was like that, a huge concentration of UFO reports. But I'll be perfectly honest, I never really investigated it, and Peter Paget's book I probably read when I was like 15 or something.
No problem. Hey.
So.
Richard's also the guy that made me ask you about the Berwyn Mountain incident when I was at the crash conference. So he's practically interviewed you himself at this point. But
the Berwyns is a weird one as well.
Yeah,
the Berwyns is a weird one.
Mm-hmm. Now we'll move on to the questions from the writers, and they only two of the writers sent in 2 questions each, and that's really cool in the sense because I've had other guests on. And I'll shoot them an email a couple of weeks before the interview or whatever, and a lot of times, they don't have a question, or they're like, you're the one that does the interviews, don't worry, I don't have anything I could ask you to already come up with or something like that. But this time when I was like, I'm interviewing Nick Redfern on Wednesday, they were like, oh, ask him this and ask him that. So Regan Lee, who you may know, Regan had 2 questions, and I guess the first one is, what do you think it is about deserts that makes for UFOs and other esoteric experiences?
Well, that's a good one. She actually asked me that the other day online. I think, that's an interesting scenario. I mean, I brought it up in the past with a lot of people. The idea that if you look back at, for example, the 1950s contactee cases like George Adamski and George Van Tassel, a lot of them occurred in desert locations where, they either felt compelled to go out or they just happened to be in the right place at the right time and saw these advanced entities, which they perceived to be aliens, at this desert location. It was kind of like a mystical experience for them. A lot of these reports are kind of like shamanic experiences. And, you go back in ancient literature and books, even things like the Bible, where it talks about, people going out into desert locations and meeting higher entities. Now, we today perceive them as angels, as aliens. In the past, it could have been angels, demons, fairies in the Middle Ages, but it's almost like, it's almost like certain locations almost lend themselves to places where people can almost like enter an altered state or an altered reality, and they have these shamanic type experiences that they interpret in ways that are relevant to their particular cultures. Now, one theory could be one of the most simplistic ones, the idea that if some sort of intelligence wants to interact with us, but doesn't necessarily want the whole world to know what's going on, it would pick locations where, yes, there might be people, but there's not going to be millions of people around, or even perhaps thousands. It could just be tens of people in some little dusty town, or, some guy hiking through the desert. I think that could be a possibility. I think also, you look at, for example, a lot of the Mexican stories, for example, Mexican Indians, for example, a lot of their culture in terms of ingesting psychedelics and, certain types of plants, etc., to invoke altered states. They go on in these same particular types of locations. They have, interactions with what they perceive as to be higher entities. There isn't really a great deal of difference between somebody going out in the desert and saying, Commander Zark of Planet 4X took me for a ride in the universe, around the universe. They're talking about going out in the desert, ingesting some particular substance, and then see one of their ancient deities or whatever revealing the secrets of the universe to them. So I think there's something about, I don't really know what it is, but I think there's something about desert locations and altered states and the isolated nature of these events that's isolated in terms of the fact that there aren't many people around that somehow opens a doorway to whatever these things are. Mm-hmm. And I think that has, obviously a bearing on the fact that they occur in the deserts. So.
All right, and her other question is, she cites an interview with Nick Pope from, I guess, the recent UFO magazine. Jeremy Vaney interviewed him, and Nick Pope said regarding crop circles that most, if not all, are fake, and that the farmers are in on it. Let me make sure I get her quote exactly. Yeah, she said he thinks most, if not all, crop circles are fake, and that, and this is in quotes, quote, the farmers are in on it. So I guess that is what he said. What do you make of that? Have you read the interview? She wants to know, and what do you make of that assertion? I guess you could say that not only are the crop circles fake, but I think that she's wondering really what you think if the farmers are in on it, if there's some sort of going on with that in that regard.
Yeah, well, I did read the interview. I've got to say, I've never actually honestly come across any evidence that a farmer was in on the story. Maybe Nick's uncovered other information, I don't know. But I've never personally come across anything to suggest that the farmer, was actively allowing this to happen so, he could profit from it by charging people to come in the field or whatever. What I will say is that I think there's a lot of misconceptions around the term crop circle hoaxers or crop circle fakers. Now, I know particularly over here, and this may be because, Britain's on the other side of the world and people aren't necessarily fully aware of the crop circle culture, they're just aware of the circles, is that there are a lot of groups and teams of people in England who make these things and make them very well. A friend of mine, Matthew Williams, is the only person in the world to date who's actually been arrested, charged and convicted for causing criminal damage in a field. In other words, he made a crop circle. Now, what's interesting about a lot of these human crop circle makers is if you ask them quite privately, and Matthew will discuss it openly, if you ask them privately, many of them have had weird experiences in their own formations that they made. And Matthew, for example, personally believes that the human crop circle makers aren't hoaxers or fakers. He believes that some sort of intelligence is manipulating them to make the formations, possibly to get people thinking about what the formations mean. Matthew believes that something is molding the minds of the crop circle makers and instilling paranormal activity, if you like, or a paranormal presence in these formations, which explains why people have weird experiences in them. Matthew is a firm believer that there's a genuine puzzle at the heart of the crop circle mystery, but he doesn't think it's nuts and bolts spacecraft making them or beaming down, laser type imagery or whatever to flatten the corn. He thinks it's almost like working with ancient magic. That something, from ancient days has come back and is, using us as a way to leave markings in the crop to get us to think about things. And he thinks that many of the crop circle makers actually puppets almost, doing the will of whatever this thing is. So I think that's the important thing to remember, that, the perception of these people as being hoaxers actually isn't correct. A lot of them, or some of them at least, do it because they consider what they do to be like a form of artwork, except their canvas is corn. But when a lot of them began to experience weird phenomena, then they realized that things weren't quite as clear-cut as it seemed. And Matthew, for example, had a couple of very weird things happen where he designed one particular formation on his computer, went out and made it, only to find that another team had come up with a very, very similar idea the same night, and they made it a few miles away, not realizing that Matthew had made his, yet the formations were almost the same. It was almost like something had put the thought out there to make this formation. But in saying that, there are other cases, for example, that clearly seem to involve something else. And I mean, ironically, it's very kind of ironic that Nick should make that statement, Nick Pope, because I found at the British National Archives some old British Air Ministry files from 1964 talking about how what sounded very much like a crop circle-like formation had been found in the north of England. It talked about how this circular patch of ground had been found and the grass had been laid over gently. Classic crop circle formation, but obviously that term wasn't in use in 64. And the guy on whose land it was found contacted somebody else who in turn wrote to the government and described how the witness had seen this strange column of blue light hovering over the field the night before, and then found this circle of flattened ground the next morning. Now, of course, this was years before the crop circle mystery kicked off, so there's no way this can be considered a latter-day hoax, because we've got the original documents on file from 64 in the government archives. So quite clearly, this wasn't somebody running around. This was something else.
Yeah.
There are even reports in the old MI5 files, which is the British equivalent of the FBI, Second World War files, where the British intelligence actually got stories from, ironically, Nazi intelligence and also Polish intelligence, where both Allied and Axis pilots flying over Germany and Europe in the Second World War reported seeing these weird circular formations in the fields. And British intelligence, MI5, at first thought that these were coded messages left for, Nazi bomber pilots. This formation means fly northeast at midnight and bomb London or whatever. It's an ingenious theory, but the important point is this offers proof that the modern-day crop circle mystery actually isn't a modern-day mystery.
Yeah.
It isn't just, although I think there's a genuine human angle to it, which is very interesting, and where it suggests people are being manipulated, something else is going on as well, and that definitely existed and was investigated by the government even, at least as back as far as the 40s.
Okay, we'll move to the next writer's questions. This is the last batch of writer questions. This is from Leslie of the Debris Field. You probably know Leslie, too. She's a very prolific online writer.
Yep.
The first question is, she's a native New Mexican. I believe that's the proper way to say it. So, she's a native of New Mexico. She's fascinated by the Taos Bigfoot story. And she says, although the Taos Indians and other Native Americans have tales of a Bigfoot-like creature in New Mexico, I've always been skeptical of it. What do you think of this Taos Bigfoot story that you talk about in the book? I have a feeling, kind of from what we've talked about and what you think is the source of all these anomalies, that probably what you're going to say. But she wants to know, what do you think it was? Do you think it was a creature? Do you think it was something that's native to the area, or something that may have escaped from the government, or some other explanation, which I think we'll probably get to?
Yeah, well, the story that I've got in the book is about a guy who reported seeing this, for want of a better term, a classic Bigfoot-type creature late at night in the vicinity of Taos. But what was weird about this was the fact that he said that it was quite clear that some sort of military helicopter appeared to be either monitoring it, shadowing it, or even chasing it, with putting a bright light on it, as if it was, literally in hot pursuit of it. Now, personally, I don't go with the theory that this was some sort of escapee of, from a secret laboratory or anything like that. I think, again, there's more to it. It's interesting that Leslie mentions things like Native American Indians, etc. If you look into a lot of the legends and tales of Native American cultures, a lot of them have these stories of these giant hairy men. But again, a lot of them also talk about these things having kind of magical properties, or they were seen in some cases of being devilish-like creatures, or there was something paranormal or weird about them. They were kind of mystical and magical animals. Now, Towson itself is, kind of a weird, mystical, magical location. I guess it's kind of an apt place where if you're going to see something like that, that would be the place to see it. Again, the problem is, I hate to sort of not give an answer, but on the other hand, if you don't have an answer, it's difficult to try and formulate something. You don't want to just say something for the sake of saying it. I think, again, there's no doubt people are seeing these things around Taos all over the place. I think we need to look at the issue of whether or not the landscape, etc., would allow something to even live there in stealth and provide enough food. That's one of the things people, often don't think about. So, I think I try and investigate all these cases, but some of them, like the Taos one, is one where there's very little I could do beyond just report on it because it was such a weird one.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then her second question is a really easy one, and one that maybe you don't get too often. Nick had what's that?
I said, uh-oh.
No, it's a good one, actually. It's kind of a fun one. So it says, Nick had 3 books come out last year. He writes numerous blogs, does lectures, interviews, and other related things. Does he ever get free time to do something that is not esoteric related, and what do you and your wife do for fun?
That's a very good question. The things I can tell you about on air, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I mean, we like to go out. We go and see bands. Where we live in Dallas, there's a couple of cool places, one called Deep Ellum, where there's a lot of little bars and clubs and bands playing on a Friday and Saturday night, So sometimes it's cover bands and sometimes it's local alternative bands and stuff like that. So we often go down there and see them on a weekend and, check them out sort of Friday night, Saturday night and, do all that and, just sort of hang around till they close and whatever. So that's one of our big things is music and just, checking out some of the local scenes and, music, I suppose, is one of my other big interests apart from sort of the paranormal, so to speak. So whether it's concerts or, watching documentaries or endlessly buying CDs and loading things on the iPod and whatever, that's one of the other ones. And, she's like me as well, though. She enjoys kind of the social aspect of going to some of these events. She's not overly keen on UFOs. But sometimes she'll come with me if it's like a paranormal event or something like that. But beyond that, we just do the normal things that everybody else does for the most part. And I like soccer. When I say football, so I watch a lot of soccer. Whenever I'm back in England, I always check out and go and see the local teams and whatever. And so just I guess the normal things. I'm not sort of
all right.
Not too weird.
That's a perfectly fine answer. All right, that's it for the writer questions and the questions from my boy Richard in Wales. So big thanks to Leslie and Regan and Richard for sending these questions in. And obviously they're huge fans of yours because they were dying to send me questions. All practically as soon as I saw that the email was sent, I got the responses. So I'm sure they're going to be psyched to hear them.
I always read Reagan's and Leslie's blogs, and there's a lot of good stuff there on them. So.
Awesome. They'll be psyched to hear that. They're really up and coming in the world of the paranormal. I'm psyched to have them a part of the Binnall of America team. We're sort of here at the home stretch now. The only other isolated question, aside from what's upcoming from you, is last year there was a lot of talk about Three Men Seeking Monsters, the movie rights being picked up. Is there any news on that story? I'm sure once they bought the movie rights, you probably know as much as I do maybe about what's going on with that, but maybe you know a little more. So any news on that?
No, I actually don't know what it was. I mean, it's, if it happens, that would be great. All it literally was that, as, it was reported on the internet, was that Universal optioned it. Film companies all across Hollywood option hundreds of films or books or manuscripts or film scripts per year, and out of those hundreds, a handful get made. But no, it's as it was a year ago. It's at the option stage. That's it. So.
And when go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's literally where it's at. It's still, as it was reported before, it's as an option.
And do you know, I guess so, since it's just like an option, you probably don't know I'm just wondering, if and when they start to make the movie or anything, you don't know how extensive your involvement with that sort of thing will be.
Oh, no, I mean, No, when they talk about an option, it is literally that a film. I mean, not
They
just
just have like
mine,
the rights to make the movie of it.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just applicable to mine. It's with any book or manuscript or film script. When a company options it, it means if they want to do something with it, they have the right to do something with it.
Yeah.
And it just depends on whether or not one day they say, okay, let's press the green button and go.
Yeah.
That's what takes it from an option to a production level, if you like. So, I mean, if it happens, great. If not, it remains as an option. So.
Yeah, hey, it all works out. What's coming up for you? The year's practically over here. I'm sure you have big plans for 2008. Given how many books you got out already, I'm sure there's a book or two in the works. And I'm sure you're speaking all over the place all the time, so I'm sure that's coming up as well. What's coming up for Nick Redfern in 2008 and beyond?
Well, I guess the first thing that's going to happen at the start of 2008 is I'm going to wake up and take lots of aspirins after New Year's Eve. And that'll be the first thing. But joking aside, I'm working on a couple more books. One which is like a localized study of weird animal reports in this place in central England I mentioned called the Cannock Chase, which is kind of, again, almost like a Point Pleasant, Virginia type situation in the mid-'60s where there's been a whole weird range of all sorts of strange phenomena over the last couple of years, all centered around this one particular large area of forest. So I'm working on a book on that, working on this werewolf book, and also one on official interest in alien abduction stories. This is one I've been chasing down. There seems to be this sort of think tank, or there was at least in the government in the 80s and through the 90s, that took a keen interest in the whole alien abduction angle and tried to get to the bottom of it. So I'm just trying to track down as many people and trying to convince a few people to speak about that as possible. And I've got a few conferences already lined up. John Downs, who I went to Puerto Rico with in 2004, I always speak at John's Weird Weekend Conference, as it's called, in August in England every year. So I'll be speaking. That's predominantly a cryptozoology conference. Held in the county of Devon, so I'll be speaking at that one in August. In February, I've got a talk, just a weekend talk coming up at the Dallas Public Library. Doing quite a bit of writing for UFO magazine and got a few upcoming articles that are going to be published in January, February in 14 Times. So, I'm always trying to keep busy, and got a few TV ideas where I, try and push a few ideas, sell a few stories to projects with TV companies, that sort of thing. And, I think when you're a freelance writer, there's always this, well, I get it anyways from time to time. People think if you write books, you're kind of living in this palatial mansion and driving a Ferrari or whatever, and which, unfortunately isn't the case. Mm-hmm. Freelance writing is like a very hazardous nightmare of a job at times, and, you have to just, I do what I do because I have a passion for it, so I enjoy it. But, at the same time, when it's your living, you have to sort of project ahead and just try and earn a living as well, and hopefully gives people something back in return that, is worth the money they're spending on it. But, it's a hazardous lifestyle when you're predominantly just working as a freelance writer, so that's why I'm always sort of projecting ahead with things. And but I enjoy it. I've still got the enthusiasm for it that I had when I was 20. Running around the woods and investigating this, or jumping on a plane to here there to investigate a chupacabras or whatever. I enjoy it, and as long as I enjoy it, I'll keep on doing it, and hopefully get some answers to some of these things. So.
Definitely. Nick, I can't thank you enough. You've been tremendously generous with your time.
No problem.
And I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the listeners are going to just die when they see a 2-hour interview with Nick Redfern coming up.
I'm always happy to do this. There's no problem at all.
Oh, awesome. And like I said, you're already a superstar. You're well on your way to becoming an icon in the field.
Well, that's true. I mean, what can I say?
Oh man, you make it so tough on me here. Yeah, you're well on your way to becoming an icon in the field. The best way I can describe it is I really think that 20 years from now we're going to look back and say, Nick Redfern is the Brad Steiger of this generation in the esoteric world. And,
well, thanks.
That's really the honest to God's truth. That's how I kind of feel about you. Your work is tremendous. Covers so many different areas that I really appreciate that. I love somebody who can look at UFOs, cryptozoology, and not be afraid to, you know, look at something else, do something else, look in one area, look in the other, and not just be like, you know, tunnel vision on things. So I have just a tremendous world of respect for you. I'm psyched that we got you back on the show.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
We've been talking about Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, a 5-year journey in search of the unknown. It's from New Page Books. People can find it all over the place, I assume. I got it at Barnes & Noble, and, you know, they can get it out by Amazon or all these different places. It's very, very easily accessible. It's definitely worth picking up. If you want to know what it's like to be an esoteric researcher, you got to read this book. This gives you the best idea of what it's like to be someone in the field and actually doing the research. There's tons of books out there that look at cases and look at mysteries. And, of course, this book looks at a ton of mysteries in and of itself. But also the book gives you an idea of what it's like to be the person looking into the mysteries. And as someone who loves the personal side of the UFO and esoteric field and the personalities, this book was just like a godsend. I really enjoyed it. I could keep babbling all day about how great you are. I'll just say thanks. Thanks for coming on the show, Nick. I really appreciate it. And hopefully our paths will cross sooner than later.
Well, thanks for having me on, Tim. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio. Big, super huge thanks to Nick Redfern for coming on the show and giving us so much time. Nick has a wealth of information on just about every esoteric mystery you can think of, so it's always fun to sit down and talk to him and really just go all over the place on the esoteric map. You can find out more information on Nick at his website, www.nickredfern.com. All one word, nickredfern.com. Check it out. Moving right along now, it's time for the final BOA Audio listener feedback of 2007. And it comes from our friend Rick. No hometown listed, just Rick. But here's what Rick has to say. Dear Tim, good to hear your voice again for Season 3. Great job, by the way. I emailed you back in May about having Gian Cassar on as a guest. I feel having a show on the Bermuda Triangle as a subject would be unbelievable. One of the best. Let me know what you think about this. What's your thought on having a group on as a guest dealing with EVPs? For example, like GIS or Ghost Pics, Brendan Cook and Barbara McBeath. They have been on C2C lots of times and really do a good show. You may have heard them yourself, but the EVPs that they collect are really clear. The best that I have heard on the internet by far. Hope you get back to me on this. Take care, Rick. Well, thank you very much for writing in, Rick. I think I do recall reading your letter as part of a BOA Audio listener feedback towards the end of Season 2. I'm happy to report that we are in the process of tracking down Gian Cassar for a future episode of BOA Audio. He's a guest that I've wanted to have on the program for a while, and I've got the feelers out to him right now. I'm hoping to hear from him and hopefully tape an episode in the not-too-distant future. He's a hard guy to get a hold of, but we'll find him. Regarding the EVP guests, I've thought about it. I think maybe we will do something like that at some point in the future. I'm going to have to do a little more investigation into who the key EVP folks are outside of the GIS, or maybe try and get a hold of the GIS folks and have them on. I'm not a huge EVP fan, but there's always stuff to explore with regards to that phenomenon. There's always new questions to be asked that we haven't really delved into yet here on the program. Thanks for writing in, Rick. Thanks for the kudos and props. I appreciate it. Stay tuned to BOA Audio. We're going to have tons of great episodes coming at you in 2008. Hopefully Gian Cassar, hopefully some EVP guests. I'm going to do my best. Rick actually picked the perfect time to write to me, as a matter of fact, because we're going to be on hiatus in January while I tape a ton of new interviews. I've got a lot of feelers out with guests and stuff, and I'm going to be just taping like a maniac all through January. I'll have more details on that at the end of the program. Rick did it, so can you. You can be a part of BOA Audio listener feedback. How do you do that? 2 ways. Either write to boaaudio@hotmail.com or go to the binnallofamerica.com website and click the contact button. Either one of those methods puts your correspondence in the BOA Audio listener feedback mailbag. Wrapping things up, I want to give huge thanks to the fantastic BOA staff, Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., and Tina Senna. Not just for all your help on the website and the audio series, but for all your help and support throughout 2007. Part of the reason why BOA is still standing here as 2007 comes to a close is because of the BOA staff. Hats off to them. Thank you so much for another unbelievable year of contributions, support, and friendship. I'm also excited to announce, since we're not going to have a show next week, we're not even going to be able to mention it, so we'll talk about it now. we have a fantastic new writer joining the BOA staff starting this coming Friday, January 4th. Rochelle Hawks joins the BOA staff with her new weekly column, Medusa's Ladder. I'm very excited that she's joining the BOA team, and I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of stuff she's going to have via Medusa's Ladder. We've been saying it week in and week out here on the program, folks, and it's the truth. If you're only listening to BOA audio and you're not reading the columns of the BOA staff, you're only getting half the story. BinnallofAmerica.com. Make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. If you want to help support BOA, there's two ways to do it. You can go to the BOA store, buy some merchandise. We still have the Veiny Mania deal going on. Or if you don't want anything from the store, you can simply go to BOA and click the PayPal button and make a donation via PayPal. No donation is too small, and all donations go towards keeping Binnall of America and BOA Audio up and running and freely available for all of our great listeners the world over. Next week on the program, there is no program, my friends. Yes, I already kind of said that here earlier in the outro, but I'll extrapolate a bit more on it for you. Every year around this time, we like to take about a month off to recharge our batteries. As you can tell, December has been a crazy, crazy month here at BOA. You may have noticed as the audio show has sort of moved from Saturdays to Sundays. As such, and as we do every year, we're going to take some time to catch our breath, roll into the new year, tape a boatload of new episodes, and kick off the second half of Season 3 at the end of January. Of course, we'll have tons more information on that. We'll have some guest teasers and stuff like that as we get closer to the return date of Season 3. On that note, we don't have much left to say here, folks. Thank you so much for an amazing 2007. So many tremendous guests we've talked to, so many awesome researchers with fantastic points of view and a wealth of new information that has coursed through the proverbial airwaves via BOA Audio. I want to thank all the great guests who appeared on the show here in 2007. I've got a lot of big plans for 2008, big projects, big stuff that I have on the horizon that hopefully come to fruition at some point in 2008. So stay tuned because the BOA franchise has just begun to take flight. And that is, of course, thanks to all of the great people who support and listen to BOA Audio and visit BinnallofAmerica.com. May you have a wonderful and safe New Year's. You'll be hearing from me in 2008 as BOA Audio Season 3 continues. Until then, this is Tim Binnall, thanking you for listening and signing off.